is Armageddon news. The trumpet judgments from God are the beginning of the major signs that the end days have started. In the series, we will discuss each one, so that you will know the sequence of events, as foretold in the book of Revelation. The sixth trumpet judgment. Revelation 9:13. Then the sixth angel blew his trumpet. I heard a voice coming from the four corners of the gold altar, standing before God. The voice said to the sixth angel, "Release the four angels who are bound at the great Euphrates River." The four angels were released, for this very hour, of this very day, of this very month and year. They had been kept ready to kill a third of all the human race. I was told the number of the mounted troops, it was 200 million. And in my vision, I saw the horses and their riders. They had breastplates red as fire, blue as sapphire, and yellow as sulfur. The horses' heads were like lions' heads. And from their mouths came out fire, smoke, and sulfur. A third of the human race was killed by those three plagues, the fire, the smoke, and the sulfur coming out of the horses' mouths. For the power of the horses is in their mouths and also in their tails. Their tails are like snakes, with heads. And they use them to hurt people. The rest of the human race, all those who had not been killed by these plagues, did not turn away from what they themselves had made. They did not stop worshipping demons, nor the idols of gold, silver, bronze, stone, and wood, which cannot see, hear, or walk. Nor did they repent of their murders, their magic, their sexual immorality, or their stealing. This trumpet judgment declares the start of World War III, and the outbreak of worldwide war, with nation against nation and kingdom against kingdom. This war will begin during the first half of the 7-year tribulation. The main army, at the center of this conflict, will be the army of the Antichrist, which will be an Islamic army, from the Middle East. The Islamic Antichrist army will wage war in the Middle East, the world, waging war on many nations. The most notable attacks by the Antichrist's army will be against Egypt. And after Egypt, Jerusalem. The declaration of war on Jerusalem will escalate into World War III, which will kill 1/3 of all mankind. And as the Apostle John described, mankind will be killed by the fire, smoke and sulfur, which comes out of their mouths, which are actually cannons, which do in fact look like fire, smoke, and sulfur, a yellow substance, is emanating out of them. And their tails, which he described as snakes with heads, are in fact guns, which like snake bites, puncture people with holes, thereby injuring them, as the Apostle John portrayed. The Apostle John even saw the exact colors of the tank optics, of red, blue and yellow, which he called breastplates. This global warfare will kill 1/3 of the world's population. The Antichrist and his Middle East army will conquer and destroy Jerusalem and overrun the city for 42 months, or 1,290 days. This will be the worst war mankind has ever experienced. It is known as the Great Tribulation, or the time of Jacob's trouble. As we discussed in our fifth trumpet broadcast, in Matthew 24:15, Jesus warns the Christians and Jews living in the West Bank and Jerusalem to flee to the hills when they see this Islamic army approaching, taking nothing with them, for there will barely be time after the announcement to escape. And anyone who does not flee immediately, but turns back to gather his goods, may lose his life. Only those who flee with the clothes on their backs will be saved. During the first half of the 7-year tribulation, before the Islamic army conquers Jerusalem, God will send Elijah and Moses to preach in Jerusalem. And they will proclaim God's salvation for 1,260 days.
תרועם בשבט ברזל, ככלי יוצר תנפצם. ועתה מלכים השכילו, התבשרו שופטי ארץ. עבדו את אדוני ביראה, וגילו ברעדה. נשקו בר פן יענף, ותאבדו דרך, כי יבער כמעט אפו, אשרי כל חוסדו.
Revelation 11:5. If anyone tries to harm them, Fire comes out of their mouths and destroys their enemies.
Next, there is Iran, where an intense effort to halt a nuclear weapons program today produced an Iranian offer to slow down the machines that are currently enriching uranium in an attempt to produce warheads. Not exactly a major breakthrough. Then there's Iraq, where an al-Qaeda offshoot has not only created the world's first terrorist state, but it is now apparently infiltrating the Iraqi army, creating concerns of a, quote, insider threat for the hundreds of U.S. advisors being sent there. Syria is so horrifying it almost defies description. The administration was issuing warnings almost 2 years ago, and fighting rages on tonight with death toll estimates now reaching 170,000. And there's more. The crisis between Ukraine and Russia also reached a fever pitch this weekend as the Russians promised, quote, irreversible consequences for what they claim was a Ukrainian mortar attack that killed a Russian civilian. And on our own southern border, a surge of young immigrants so desperate that Fox News today received reports that the bodies of children are now washing up on the shores of the Rio Grande after failed attempts to cross into the United States. Despite all the evidence, the president recently suggested to some young Americans that things around the world have never been better.
If you had to choose any moment to be born in human history, not knowing what your position was going to be, who you were going to be, you choose this time. The world is less violent than it has ever been.
Less violent than ever? The Wall Street Journal today suggested the last time we saw things this bad was back during the Carter administration. And here's what happened when our own Ed Henry today challenged the White House on that.
How does the White House react to the notion that the president is a bystander to all these crises?
I think that there have been a number of situations in which you've seen this administration intervene in a meaningful way that has substantially furthered American interests and substantially improved the tranquility of the global community.
What? Mark Thiessen is a former presidential speechwriter, a Washington Post columnist, and a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Dana Milbank of the Washington Post, not exactly a conservative, comes out and writes today, tranquility? Where? In Iceland? I mean, that's being mocked. Tranquility?
Yeah, tranquility. Yeah, that's the word. That's the word we're looking for. Tranquility. Where is it tranquil? In Israel? Is Israel tranquil? Is Iraq tranquil? Is Syria tranquil? Is Afghanistan tranquil? Is Ukraine tranquil? None of these places are tranquil. This is the least tranquil time we have had since the 1970s. And what do we have in common with the 1970s? Feckless leadership from the White House, which is contributing to all of these crises. President Obama came into power and reached out to our enemies instead of standing shoulder to shoulder with our adversaries, cut defense spending instead of increasing it, and has retreated from the world instead of projecting American power. And the result of that is he wants to restrain American power. Our enemies don't see restraint. They see weakness, and weakness is provocative. And when they see weakness and a vacuum, they're going to step in and fill it, and Islamic radicals are ascendant in the world right now.
Is this comparison to the Carter years fair? Because, there was such malaise in the 1970s on so many fronts, especially the home front, more so than many believe is happening right now in this country. And many have posited that comparison is simply not fair.
It is not fair. I agree with you. It's not fair to Jimmy Carter. The fact is, when Jimmy Carter, after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, Jimmy Carter figured out that he was wrong, and he turned around. The Reagan defense buildup actually started under Jimmy Carter. After the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, he increased defense spending 4.6% and pledged to do it for the next 5 years. He announced the Carter Doctrine, in which he said that America would use military force in order to defend its interests in the Persian Gulf. Has Barack Obama done any of these things? Barack Obama is sending pink slips to our military while all this is happening right now. He's launched the biggest defense cuts in American history. He's withdrawing from the world. He's not projecting American power. I mean, Jimmy Carter, for all of his problems, was actually a more learned from his mistakes and tried to correct them. Barack Obama doesn't seem to be changing anything.
Now, you were, among other things, the chief speechwriter for President George W. Bush, and in particular, you had a focus on foreign policy. You know that he was accused of cowboy diplomacy, of getting us involved in too many wars, of shooting first and asking questions later. And then we had Barack Obama, who took a different tact. Critics of George W. Bush would say, We had to change. We had to step out because we had been so aggressive under George W. Bush that the American people no longer had the stomach for further cowboy diplomacy.
Well, I've heard those complaints. There was something called 9/11, which happened, where thousands of people were killed in our midst. I was in the Pentagon, so I felt that building shake. And our country felt the building shake. And so we had to go out and defend our interests. And what has happened is these problems are the result of our policies. Iraq and Syria. Obama wanted to withdraw and end Bush's war, so he pulled out and created a power vacuum. We had defeated al-Qaeda in Iraq, which is now ISIS. We withdrew. They have come back into power, are creating a state in Syria and Iraq. And you know who's helping the Iraqis to defend themselves? Iran. So we now have a situation where our Shia enemies are fighting our Sunni enemies for control of Iraq. That's what happens when America withdraws. And I know people are weary of war, but we can't. What we are seeing, all the pictures you are showing on your screen right now, that is the result of what happens when America does not lead.
Mark Thiessen, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Megan.
And joining me now with more, Mark Hanna, a Democratic campaign veteran who worked on the Kerry and Obama presidential campaigns. Mark, tranquility? Tranquility?
Yeah, you don't see a lot of tranquility in the world if you're reading the papers or if you're watching the news right now, Megan.
Right.
Completely agree.
You shouldn't have said that.
Tranquility may be the wrong word choice, for sure. Is the underlying point, though, that the world is, in general, looking back at history, looking at the Cold War, where we faced the threat of nuclear annihilation, looking at, for example, world wars, where we had major powers.
We kind of face that right now.
We don't face nuclear annihilation.
Well, are we a little worried about North Korea? We're a little worried about Iran. I'm a little worried about ISIS. Did you hear Eric Holder talking about Syria and the bombs being made over there?
The article that was published in the Wall Street Journal today was alarmist. There was an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal 2 years ago that actually affirmed what the president said, that in terms of people who are dying violent deaths is down more than it's ever been, and as a result of free trade, as a result of commerce flowing, as a result of cosmopolitanism. There are people that want to basically portray the president as weak. Has his foreign policy been cautious? Yes, but what got us to these problems in the first place? It's not an abundance of caution. Mark Thiessen was saying Bush's policies, for example, 9/11 somehow tying that to our national interest in Iraq, that's bogus. And it's been shown to be bogus.
Well, in retrospect, there seems to be agreement on that point. But let me ask you this.
There was not enough caution.
Because I point to the Bush administration with Thiessen, because I do think there's a correlation to the American public's feeling about our intervention overseas. Mm-hmm. We got hit on 9/11. The public was very much behind going over to Afghanistan, less so Iraq, and now in retrospect very much against the Iraq war. But we had a president who at the time said he was trying to bring the battle to the enemy rather than having them bring it on the home front. The question is whether now we have a president who is too reluctant to lead, leaving us more vulnerable than ever.
I don't think so. You've got the President Bush wanted to take the battle to the enemy. In doing so, his plan strategically backfired, probably creating more terrorists than he destroyed, stirring up resentment in the region, which we're seeing right now with the formation of ISIS.
There was plenty before
Iraq
we went over there.
The fact of the matter is Iraq did not pose a national security threat to the United States before we went in. Now with the creation of ISIS and its radicalization in the region, it does. That's you can't dispute that.
Well, I don't, but I'm not disputing that point necessarily, but I'm disputing the status of Iraq, because Vice President Joe Biden said it was going to be his administration. The Obama administration is one of their greatest successes.
Right.
And
John Kerry urged Iraqi leaders on all sides to urgently build a new government. Now, Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki is under increasing pressure to step down.
I think there is a broad sense that Iraq's leaders understand the urgency here. Now, I think we will know very soon whether they really understand it and whether they're willing to back up that sentiment with actions.
Today in Israel, the nation buried 3 Israeli teens abducted and murdered in the West Bank. As the government debates retaliation, many are bracing themselves for a new conflict just weeks after U.S.-led peace talks broke down this spring.
We're stuck in a region critical to American interests. We can't leave, and we can't transform it. And if you can't fix something, and you can't leave it behind, then you have to do the next best thing, which is to transact, which is to figure out what's vital from what's discretionary, what's doable from what isn't, and then act accordingly.
The White House is extremely concerned about the deteriorating situation in Israel, urging restraint on all sides to prevent, as White House spokesman Josh Earnest said, one terrible act from leading to a much broader, much more destabilizing situation. And you know that phrase, much broader, more destabilizing situation, could apply really to so many places in that region right now.
Yeah, it really is. It's a conflagration in a way. Jim Sciutto, thank you so much. And we have more now on rising tensions in Israel after the burial of those 3 slain teenagers and the possibility of another retaliatory attack. Our senior international correspondent, Ben Wiedemann, has more on this from Jerusalem.
Brianna, tens of thousands of Israelis turned out for the funeral of the 3 Israeli teenagers whose bodies were discovered yesterday afternoon. This was a drama that transfixed the country for 18 days following the 12th of June kidnapping in the southern West Bank. It was a somewhat different scene here in Jerusalem, where I saw hundreds of mostly young Israelis chanting death to Arabs. There are reports of several Palestinians being attacked by this angry mob. Now, this evening, the Israeli cabinet is meeting yet again to ponder the next moves in the aftermath of the death of the 3 teenagers. We heard from Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who said Israel will take a 3-pronged approach. On the one hand, it's going to try its very best to find the perpetrators of the kidnappings and the killings of the 3 teenagers. Then it's going to crack down on the infrastructure of Hamas in the West Bank. And finally, he said Israel will operate against Hamas in Gaza. That word indicating perhaps Israel is not pondering a massive thrust against Hamas in Gaza. Brianna?
Ben Wiedemann for us there. And we're joined now by White House Press Secretary Josh Earnest. Josh, thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Sure, Brianna. How are you?
I'm very good. Thank you very much. I want to ask you, because this was something that you have said, where you're talking about seeking some details about who precisely is responsible for the killings of these 3 Israeli teens. Israel at this point says it is Hamas. These are Hamas activists. Does the U.S. share that opinion?
Well, Brianna, what we noticed is that some leaders in Hamas had actually indicated that they were pleased that these kidnappings had taken place. They celebrated the news of the kidnappings.
But
in Gaza, crisis tonight, simply put, it's war. Air raid sirens going off in cities across the country, whether it's special events like this wedding or just a day on a Tel Aviv beach, people fleeing from abroad, from Gaza. Israel's Iron Dome missile defense system seeing a lot of action into the night there. Israeli authorities saying militants have sent more than 130 rockets their way. Meantime, Israel's Operation Protective Edge, so-called, is in full swing. Officials saying about 150 terror sites in Gaza have been hit. Late today, Israeli armed forces put this video online. They say these are Hamas fighters coming ashore, said to be armed with Kalashnikovs and grenades. A short time later, Israeli troops, air and naval forces open up on them, killing all 5, according to the Israeli Defense Force. And from Jerusalem, word that another 40,000 reserve troops may be getting the call to action. One Israeli official telling CNN possible ground maneuvers, presumably into Gaza, may become necessary, an echo, perhaps a louder echo of what happened there and what we witnessed firsthand back in November 2012. And members of one family, also 2 media centers built in. Those are all large explosions. That occurred in Gaza back then. Ben Wiedemann standing exactly where I stood back then. Ben joins us now. It's been the Israeli military ramping up their assault on Hamas today. What's the latest?
Yes, what we've seen, Anderson, it's not like it was when you were here and I were here in 2012. Israel's approach seems to be much more targeted. For instance, today, this evening, what we've seen is specific targeting of leaders of Islamic Jihad and Hamas's military wing, strikes in the south, the central, and northern part of Gaza. So they seem to be much more focused than they were before. In addition to hitting those leaders when they were out and about, they've also been striking at their homes as well. We were at one house in Khan Yunis, where this is a family affiliated with Hamas. We saw that 7 people were killed there, including 2 children, when apparently the woman who heads the household there got a phone call from a man called David, speaking Hebrew, telling her to leave the house immediately. However, what happened is that people from the neighborhood clustered around the house, gathered around the house as human shields, so to speak, and then the Israelis struck, killing 7. But as I said, the real focus seems to be not on sort of large targets, but rather individuals.
The Israeli cabinet has now approved the military to call as many as 40,000 reservists. The military is saying, though, that a ground attack, while possible, it's not imminent. Is that correct?
Yes, and first of all, it takes a long time to mobilize those 40,000 men, to get them down around Gaza with the right ammunition and hardware for a ground operation. I was in Gaza in 2009, January, when there was a ground incursion. It's a big operation. There's a lot of challenges because it's one thing to do airstrikes, but when you send men inside Gaza, some of these alleyways and refugee camps, there's a high probability of many casualties among Israeli forces, and of course among the Palestinians themselves, who, unlike the Israelis, don't have bomb shelters or protected rooms. So there is some hesitation among Israeli military leaders to sort of take that step at this point, despite the fact that the government did authorize the call-up, if necessary, of 40,000 men.
Then I appreciate the reporting. Be careful for you and your team. There is a lot more coverage tonight. Susan Hendricks is at 360 Bulletin. Susan.
Anderson, a powerful typhoon is churning toward mainland Japan.
Facility, you know, the Hamas stockpiles, then they don't want to go in on the ground.
They don't want to, but what we're being told is that they have these tunnels and that they're exploiting, the Palestinians, Hamas are exploiting these tunnels, and Israel is really left with very little choice but to go in on the ground, hence the tens of thousands of soldiers who are getting ready to do that, we're told.
Well, Hamas has made this decision somewhat easier for the Israelis because of the response to the ceasefire offer. If they had accepted the ceasefire, we wouldn't be talking about a ground invasion.
They told Israel to pound sand.
Exactly. We're only doing this now. We're only having this conversation because Hamas's response was to fire in hundreds more rockets into Israel, specifically going after the most densely populated areas that they could. And so now the Israelis are once again in a position where they would rather not go in on the ground. That's messier from a casualty perspective. It's also messier from an international relations and public affairs perspective. But they want to dismantle this terror network. Netanyahu says he's very serious about this. He says they will get the calm that they need, and I think that we should take him at his word. So unless there's a ceasefire, this is what's going to happen.
So they go into this negotiation brokered by Egypt, and Israel is saying, we'd like you to stop bombing us, and Hamas is saying, well, we would like you to stop existing. Yeah. And one wonders how any negotiation can go forward.
There's no negotiation that can go forward. And the problem with it now is it will now start mounting with a lot of casualties. Why? Because the Palestinians, the Hamas, uses its people to protect its missiles. Israel uses its missiles to protect people, but Hamas uses people as human shields. So we will now start seeing civilian casualties because Hamas puts its rocket launchers, its military facilities, its arms depots in apartment buildings, in schools and hospitals. They want to have the big casualties because they want to play to the World Court of Public Opinion. Say, see, look at all the terrible damage Israel's doing to us. Therefore, not only does Israel not have the right to exist, they're the aggressors, even though it was the Palestinians who attacked.
It is sick. And Buck, to explain to the viewers how is this relevant to their lives? Obviously, there are a lot of Americans who watch very closely Israel and the Middle East, but how is this affecting lives here at home, safety here at home, and what role did we play in what's happening overseas tonight?
Well, it affects us for one, because obviously a lot of Americans have family and friends who are in Israel, who are in the cities that are currently existing under this reign of terror, which is what's happening. They're specifically firing missiles that can't actually really be targeted, missiles that are just intended to fall on literally anybody in a populated area. This is how Hamas does business.
They don't care
so if it hits an orphanage, if it hits a home for old ladies, Hamas thinks, great, we've committed the most atrocious thing we possibly can. It also, of course, affects us because we have Israel as our strongest ally in the Middle East, and the stability that we are hoping to once again bring back to the Middle East, or relative stability, I guess, under this administration, has been pretty terrible. So there's a lot of reasons why I think we have to focus in on Hamas right now and try to get an understanding of the moral calculation that's at play. I mean, for one, the Israelis, as Casey pointed out, are trying to do the least damage they can to get this violence to stop. They just want this to end. But Hamas, in some sort of perverse reverse incentive, actually wants more casualties to occur among the Palestinians, because then they turn to the world and say, look at the big bad Israelis. Look what they do to us. So Israel wants casualties to end, to stop. They want peace and calm. Hamas wants more dead people, more women and children children out on the streets being laid out for the cameras. And until they have had enough of that, they're not going to stop these rockets.
Was there any role for us to have played here, KT? You know, John Kerry tried to broker some sort of a peace process that failed miserably. You know, he set an artificial deadline that they did not meet, and then, of course, that was the end of it. And, you know, there was a lot of questioning about whether he should have said, okay, 9 months from now, it better be done.
Yeah, well,
and 9 months came and went, and it wasn't done, and we looked a little, you know,
it was a hopeless
ineffective
task anyway. What the United States needs to do is understand two things. If Israel ceases to exist, if Israel's now surrounded on every single side of Israel, it has an enemy. It has either Al-Qaeda or ISIS or Hamas or anybody. All those groups want to exterminate the state of Israel. The United States is potentially drawn into something like that, but I think more importantly, understand the only way you ultimately defeat radical Islam is starve them. Why? Because they have Arab oil money is fueling all sides of the fighting. I mean, it is the mother's milk of terrorism, and until we become energy independent, until we drive the price of oil down in the ground, these groups are going to use that money to attack Israel, to attack the United States, to attack each other.
Interesting. KT, thanks for being here. Buck, you too.
Thanks.
We'll stay on it. Also tonight, a new effort by Democrats to demonize the Supreme Court and cast stones at Hobby Lobby. Up next, we will fact-check yet again the new claims for dishonesty, and we will look at the...
Continues. Instead of agreeing to a ceasefire deal initiated by Egypt and accepted by Israel, Hamas's reply was more rockets. Israel halted its attacks for 7 hours, but cannot hold back after Hamas fired more than 70 rockets at the Jewish state. Tonight, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said his country will exert quote-unquote great force against Hamas following its rejection of the truce deal.
We prefer to end all in a diplomatic way. Hamas left us with no choice but to enlarge the operation. We will continue to hurt the terror.
Hamas said it had never been consulted by Egypt about the ceasefire.
We will not stop the fighting before they accept all the conditions of the Palestinian resistance. The announcement by the Israeli occupation to end the fighting from one side does not mean anything for us.
For the first time since the conflict started 8 days ago, an Israeli has been killed. A man, authorities say, was struck by Hamas mortar fire along the Israel-Gaza border. On the other side, close to 200 Palestinians have been killed, more than 1,300 injured during the conflict. 2 Palestinians were killed today, one a 77-year-old man. Tonight, more rockets were fired at Israel, including Tel Aviv, as some in Israel's cabinet are calling for an even stronger action to
come
stop
on,
it.
man. That's war.
There is no need to give blows.
That's not a crisis.
There is no need
That is
to
war.
retaliate. There is a need to leave. There is a need to end this operation when the Israeli army is in control over the whole Gaza Strip.
And the IDF, Israel Defense Forces, are warning people here in northern Gaza to evacuate their homes, to head to shelters, and that could be a sign that something major may be in the works, possibly even a ground offensive. Brett?
John Hadi live in Gaza City early Wednesday morning. John, thank you. Now to Iran, where Secretary of State John Kerry says there are very real gaps between the Tehran government and the West over nuclear issues. Kerry says there has been tangible progress on some key subjects, and that talks will continue until at least some.
They say mortar fire from Gaza killed an Israeli man near a border crossing. Meantime, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is threatening great force against Hamas after the militants rejected a plan for a ceasefire. The Israeli military reports its forces launched at least a dozen airstrikes on Gaza after Hamas turned down the proposal from Egypt. Of course, largely the reason they turned it down is because none of the demands of Hamas were even discussed. They weren't even mentioned in this peace plan. Many on the Hamas side say they felt rejected, even snubbed. Israeli officials say they agreed to the plan, but Hamas militants did not and kept right on firing rockets. The Israeli military reports some of those rockets reached deep into Israel, including near the northern port city of Haifa. See, this is the Gaza down here. That's the Gaza right on the sea. This is the West Bank. So all the firing is coming from here in the Gaza. There's Tel Aviv. They've been close to Tel Aviv before this incursion, but not all the way there. They've gotten there this time. You see Haifa way at the top. There's a very important power plant up there that the militants would love to hit. So far, thankfully, they've not been able to do that. Sirens also reportedly went off this morning in those towns 60 miles north of the Gaza. The U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry is condemning the Hamas attacks and says the White House will continue pushing for a ceasefire. Easier said than done when both sides are not represented at the table. Our John Huddy is live. He's in Gaza City tonight. What's the situation on the ground there like tonight?
Well, Shepard, I was just kind of looking over my shoulder right before you tossed to me because there was an airstrike just moments ago. The night sky's been illuminated a couple times here in Gaza City over the course of the last few minutes. Rocket launches and then airstrikes like the one I just mentioned. So that continues tonight in the wake of this ceasefire agreement that broke down. You know, Israel, as you mentioned, accepted it for about 7 hours. They held off on firing at Hamas starting around 9 a.m. local time here in Gaza, and over that period of time, Hamas fired about 70 rockets at Israel. So after about 7 hours, Israel finally had enough and launched several missile strikes, including one that we saw earlier this afternoon that shook the building that we're in. So far, and you mentioned this at the top, Shepard, one person has now lost their life in Israel. You know, throughout the course of the last 8 days since all of this started, only a couple people have been injured in Israel. Well, now we're getting word that a man was killed by, according to Israeli officials, Hamas mortar fire on the Israel-Gaza border. So that's the first fatality. There's been some damage, some injuries, but that's the first fatality. Meanwhile, on the other side of the border here in Gaza, close to 200 Palestinians have been killed and more than 1,200 have been injured. And at this point, Shepard, more than 17,000 remain in UN shelters, including one that we went to the other day. And a lot of these people just escaped their homes with nothing but the clothing they were wearing, and also some didn't even have shoes on, Shepard.
Prime Minister Netanyahu over in Israel spoke to the nation. What did he say tonight?
Well, he said that Israel was going to exert, quote-unquote, great force against Hamas because of Hamas's unwillingness to sit at the table or accept a ceasefire agreement. And many in Israel's cabinet are calling for a ground invasion. They're calling for things to step up even more, to go from forget just the aerials and heavy artillery fire, but some actually want troops on the ground to come into Gaza and occupy Gaza. So really at this point, Shepard, we're waiting to see if everything kind of intensifies through the night, and based on the last 8 days, we're assuming that will be the case. We'll see. Shep.
John Huddy for us from the Gaza side of things. John, thanks very much. Well, you can forget no more leg room. Who wants that?
Well, more rocket attacks all over Israel. That forced Israel to resume its targeted airstrikes in Gaza. John Huddy, live for us in Gaza City. So, John, what have you seen and heard today?
Yeah. Well, we just saw an airstrike, actually, just about maybe 10, 15 minutes ago, just in the distance behind us, and I'm kind of keeping an eye out, Gretchen, to see if anything else is going to happen. Things are already heating up, by the way. Not only did we see that airstrike a little while ago, but over the course of the last 30 minutes, we've seen several rockets launched from the Gaza City area. And this just goes along with the overall concern and thought that things are going to continue to increase in terms of the violence. Now, earlier this evening, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addressed his country, saying that Israel was going to, quote-unquote, exert great force against Hamas for not accepting the ceasefire agreement. Now, Israel had accepted an agreement that started at 9 a.m. this morning. It lasted 6 hours. Israel put on hold any strikes against Hamas, but finally countered and fired back when Hamas let loose a barrage of about 70 rockets at Israel over that period of time. And finally, Israel launched several missile strikes like the one you saw there and like the one we just saw a couple minutes ago. In total, I'm going to go to my notes on this, 120 rockets have been fired at Israel since 9 a.m. this morning. 104 have hit. 22 were intercepted by Israel's Iron Dome defense. And meanwhile, the Israeli Defense Forces have struck 33 targets, and that number likely continues to grow. This, as now we hear, there's been one fatality, an Israeli man who was killed by Hamas mortar fire. That's the first person in Israel killed since all of this started 8 days ago. And now, here in Gaza City, Gretchen, we're going into the 9th day. So really the question is, are we going to see things continue to intensify here on the ground in Gaza City? We're keeping a lookout. Back to you.
So much for a ceasefire. John Huddy, thank you. Three Pinocchios for President Obama. The Washington Post disputing the president's repeated claim that Republicans constantly block any effort to help the middle class. Here's what he said just this weekend.
So far this year, Republicans in Congress have blocked every serious idea to strengthen the middle class.
But Check this out. Look at that happy family. One day earlier, House Speaker John Boehner and Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi together signing a jobs training bill. Boehner releasing a photo with the headline, "This is what working together looks like." And here's what Pelosi had to say.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, for bringing us together. Thank you for your leadership. Thanks to Chairman Klein, Chairwoman Fox, Ranking Member Miller, Ranking Member and a host, John Tierney, Senators Harkin and Patty Murray, for getting us to this place where we can all come together in a very bipartisan, overwhelming way to support this jobs training bill.
Kumbaya, my lord. Remember that from camp? Everyone working together to help the middle class. If it weren't so sad, I don't mean to laugh. We need to help the middle class. But, come on, everyone taking credit for coming together. But, not according to President Obama. Bernard Whitman is a former Bill Clinton pollster, CEO of Whitman Insight Strategies. Mark Larson is a Southern California radio talk show host. All right, you remember Kumbaya? Kumbaya. Okay, they're a happy family, but the president got his nose grew over the weekend. He got 3 Pinocchios.
You know what's so surprising, Gretchen, is that it took the Washington Post this long. I mean, I've been watching Pinocchio Vision for the last almost 6 years here with the nose crashing through the screen. The question is, who's playing Geppetto? I mean, who's really working on the puppeteering here? However, that is, in defense of the president, that was so yesterday. What difference does it make? It was just a couple of days ago that there was an agreement. Because if you deal with today's truth, that's all that matters.
Well, Bernard, I mean, what are we to make of it? Because, you know, I guess politicians can say whatever they want, and it's up to the Washington Post to figure out whether or not they're telling the truth or not. But they did sign the Farm Bill, bipartisan, the Home Heating Emergency Assistance Through Transportation Act, the Homeowner Flood Insurance Affordability Act, the Water Resources Reform and Development Act. I mean, not on the huge issues, but there has been some commingling.
Yeah, look, here's what's going on. It is political season, so you're going to see hyperbole on both sides. I think the president went way beyond the pale to suggest that the Republicans have shot down every serious idea. I think the bigger issue here is the decline of bipartisanship and the corresponding increase in political negativity that we've seen really go on for the last couple of decades. And I think that it's a failure of leadership on both sides. I think it's a failure on the speaker's part because he so rarely can control his conference. And frankly, I think it's a failure on the president's part because he seems to not understand some of the basic operating principles of politics. Number one is which you've got to invest in building relationships, personal relationships that ultimately yield political rewards. And he hasn't done that.
Don't you remember growing up that your mom or your dad always told you to rise above the situation?
Which is what the president's trying to do, in talking to the people and saying those people are all...
Well, not really, though. I mean, if you saw how much glee there was between Boehner and Pelosi that they actually could agree on something, wouldn't it be great if the president would come out and say, hey, that was a great example, we should do more of that?
It's not going to do that because it's away from the paradigm. You want to keep making it seem like there are people who are playing in the political sandbox, and he will just take his pen and take his phone, although he doesn't use the phone to call them very much. This just continues to complicate it. I think when you're dealing with moral relativism and you start the day with today's truth, then the president, I think he truly believes that they've been hammering the middle class when his policies have been jackhammering the middle class in many respects for the last nearly 6 years.
So are Speaker Boehner and Nancy Pelosi, Bernard, being disingenuous then in their happiness about coming together? Because many people watching right now would say, well, they haven't figured anything else out on the big, huge issue.
No, they're actually genuinely working in the interests of the country. I mean, the fact of the voters disapprove of what's going on, and the president's approval rating is 43, Congress is at 15. And the truth is, we are a divided country, we're a divided government, we're going to have a divided government at least till 2016. The only way we can move forward is to move forward together. I think it's unlikely that much is going to happen in the waiting days of this Congress before the next Congress. I am hopeful that somehow we can bring back some spirit of bipartisanship. Let's get Keystone passed, let's get immigration reform done. Before the election, not going to happen, but I'm looking forward to February.
I'll go with you on Keystone, that's good progress.
Yeah, and that would be bipartisan. Yeah. And maybe in the commercial break you'll tell me who's going to play Geppetto. Okay?
I have some ideas.
Okay.
Valerie. Oh, just a thought.
All right, great to see the both of you. Thank you. Well, lots of extreme weather around the country today in the form of heavy rains. Here's the scene in Arlington, Virginia. And a little farther up the coast, in New Jersey, some flash flooding going on. Meteorologist Janice Dean, live in the Fox Extreme Weather Center. You know, Janice, some people just coming in, Bernard and Mark, say it's pretty bad, even right here in New York City right now.
Let's take a look at Times Square right now, where it feels very ominous, almost like 8 o'clock at night. Look at that. Yes, we have a flash flood warning in place and the potential for severe thunderstorms through the afternoon and evening. Let's take a look at it.